functionalities that Alexandra and Katie have come up with. So. And let's give it a couple of seconds as people dial into the Zoom room. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you to the nearly 200 participants who've registered to join us today for this roundtable discussion with the PILPG Circle of Former Ambassadors to the Human Rights Council. During today's discussion, we will explore two human rights issues that are critical in 2023, women's rights and environmental rights. Our guests today will reflect on these through a lens of the Universal Periodic Review, the UPR as we'll call it, a unique and important process involving a review of the human rights records of all UN member states aimed at improving the protection of human rights globally. My name is Paul Williams, and I'm the co-founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group and the Rebecca Grazier Professor at American University. I am deeply honored today to be moderating the roundtable alongside Ambassador Amanda Ellis, the former ambassador of New Zealand to the United Nations in Geneva. Thank you for joining me today, Amanda. I'm
delighted to be here with you, Paul. Thank you for including us.
Great. I'm also delighted to be joined by our esteemed panelist from PILPG's Circle of Former Ambassadors, Ambassador Juan Esteban Aguirre, Ambassador Dr. Irathushim Adam, and Ambassador Zorica Maric Djordjevic. Please note that the roundtable will be 60 minutes long, and we will be recording this roundtable and posting it on our website. We ask you to please submit any questions that you have for our speakers in the Q&A function, and we will answer them as available. We will also be sending a follow-up email to those who've registered for the program and watched the program with the detailed bios of our participants and also some additional information that our roundtable experts would like to share with you. Now, before we move on to the full introductions of our panelists and the rest of today's discussion, we are very honored to be able to welcome Mr. Gianni Magazzini, former chief of the Universal Periodic Review Branch of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and a UN expert at large. It is a privilege to have Mr. Magazzini join us today to provide opening remarks that address the crucial role that the Universal Periodic Review plays in promoting human rights protections and the lessons that have been learned throughout the application of UPR over the prior decades. Mr. Magazzini will also join our expert roundtable discussion over the course of the event. Mr. Magazzini, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Now, let me kick it off with a question for you for your presentation. In light of the 75 years of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we would be grateful to hear your reflections on the Universal Periodic Review, its successes, challenges that have arisen in the implementation of the mechanism, and why more attention should be paid to the mechanism's potential for furthering human rights. Over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning to all of you. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to introduce the UPR, which in my view is the best tool to domesticate human rights norms, to strengthen national protection system, thus also to address root causes of violations. While a peer review state to state with 100% participation so far, the UPR considered concluding observation, recommendation from treaty bodies, special procedures mandate holders, and input from the entire UN system, regional mechanism, national institution, and civil society organizations. Review results in a detailed checkup following 3.5 hours examination, where over 100 states provide on average 250 recommendations on what the state under review needs to do to improve the health of its human rights system. Since 2008, every UN member state has subjected itself every 5 years to these probing reviews through an agreed calendar. At variance with other human rights mechanisms, the UPR provides opportunity for states to consider each recommendation received, to engage in broad consultation with the other branches of the government and various national stakeholders. This is often done through national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up, which are led by ministers, resulting in sovereign decisions on recommendations states accept or note in session of the Human Rights Council, which are webcasted and archived as the official record of the UPR outcome adoption 3-4 months after each review. Clearly, the UPR accepted recommendation create entry points for action to ensure compliance with legal obligations, to improve the rule of law, to make progress on equality and non-discrimination, leading to greater protection of rights and greater accountability of those responsible for violations. The enhanced implementation agenda of the fourth cycle of the UPR requires a much stronger compact between states, the international community, and the UN system, and greater form of North-South, South-South cooperation to achieve concrete results. In his call to action for human rights in 2020, the Secretary General praised the UPR and requested guidance for heads of UN offices worldwide so as to maximize its use before, during, and after the reviews. A repository of UPR good practices by the UN system was recently issued. It contains examples from 18 countries where progress was made, for instance, in abolishing capital punishment, in decriminalizing defamation, in setting up national preventive mechanism in line with OPCAT, in passing groundbreaking legislation for the protection of human rights defenders. The repository contains also example of action to combat violence against women and to advance women's rights. OHCHR has developed various tools to facilitate implementation, among them a matrix of thematically clustered UPR recommendations, which allows the rapid search of any issue, country by country, online, resulting in a listing of relevant recommendations indicating the state that made them, the position of the state under review, as well as the link to the corresponding SDGs. The matrix identifies also possible risk areas, often recommendations that, while important, have only been noted by the state. Last October, the Human Rights Council provided OHCHR through a consensus resolution resources to facilitate support to states through UPR dedicated staff deployed in its regional offices. That resolution also requested the holding of an high-level panel, which took place on 1st March and resulted in the creation of a group of friends in the council led by Argentina. Acknowledgement by the Deputy Secretary General that the UPR is one of our most impactful instruments to promote human rights as part of development, and the readiness of the UN development system to support implementation. Advised by the former OECD DAC chair, the members of the DAC, when making recommendations to states that are of priority for their ODA, could support their implementation when accepted. And finally, recognitions that forms of South-South cooperation should also be expanded, building, for instance, on the positive experience of Paraguay with Semura Plus. In conclusion, weaknesses in human rights identified through the UPR should therefore be prioritized for action. We can no longer wait for emergencies to occur and for prevention to fail, since the cost in terms of human suffering and financial requirement are staggering and increasing every year. In 2022, 14% of ODA was identified by DAC members as in donors' refugee costs, some $30 billion, In 2015, it was about 3%, 5 billion. So focusing systematically on what needs to be done and can be done to strengthen the national human rights protection system to ensure respect for the rule of law through the entry point created by the UPR is not only the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. In addition to states, the international community, the UN system, it is very important that also civil society organizations, foundations, universities look more closely at the UPR and its growing contribution to the protection of rights and the prevention of humanitarian crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Magazzini, for those insightful remarks relating to how the UPR functions, and in particular for your advocacy or call for a more robust utilization of the UPR mechanism to promote the rule of law, which is essential for protecting human rights. With that set up, let's now move on to the rest of our discussion today. This is the second of 3 roundtable discussions scheduled throughout the year with PILPG's Circle of Former Ambassadors to the UN Human Rights Council. This is also the 75th year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and our conversation comes before the next session of the Human Rights Council, which convenes on Monday from June 19th to July 14th. And the second regular session each year includes an important discussion on women's rights. And this year as well, there's going to be a discussion on the issues of environmental rights. And those will be 2 important foci of this year's discussion at the Human Rights Council. In today's expert roundtable, we will discuss the powerful relationship between the UPR, as eloquently introduced to us by Mr. Magazzini, and enhancing accountability for women's and environmental rights, all with an awareness of what the 75th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights means for further progress in pursuing human rights for all. Amanda, let me turn the microphone over to you so you can introduce our ambassadors.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, Mr. Magazzini, for that wonderful introduction to such important topics, which are very much interrelated. And I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished panelists and my former colleagues. Today, we are honored to welcome Ambassador Jorge Esteban Aguirre, who is the former ambassador of Paraguay and the former UN Human Rights Council Vice President. We're also very excited to welcome Ambassador Dr. Iruthasham Adam, former ambassador of the Maldives and former UN Human Rights Council Vice President. Welcome, Iru. Wonderful to have you with us again. And finally, delighted to have Ambassador Zorica Maric-Djordjevic, who is chair of the PILPG Circle of Ambassadors and the former ambassador of Montenegro. Welcome, everybody. It's terrific to have you with us. And for full speaker bios, please visit the PILPG website. Thank you all for agreeing to share your wisdom in today's panel. So we'd like to start, Paul, I think you're going to ask the first ambassador to begin. Wonderful, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Amanda, for those introductions. Let me jump in with the first question to Ambassador Aguirre. You've been closely involved in preparing and presenting Paraguay's first and second UPRs, and Paraguay, like many countries, is in the process of implementing those recommendations. Considering other human rights mechanisms in Latin America, what can the Human Rights Council learn, and how can it best engage countries to effectively implement these recommendations of the UPR? Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, Zorica. Hello, Amanda. Hello, Iru. Hello, Gianni. And hello to all of you colleagues and friends joining us. It is a privilege to be among you discussing this very vital subject of human rights and how to promote, how to protect them, and make them elements in how we govern, how we conduct business and develop as individuals and as countries. And of course, taking advantage of this great opportunity created by PILPG. In preparing for this webinar, and I love the word webinar, and Paul's question now in Gianni Magazzini's brilliant and experienced introduction for this panel, it started me thinking of my own country's efforts to articulate and prepare for our participation in the UPR review. Some background and a little context first. Many of you may know that Paraguay went through 35 years of dictatorship. Martial law was renewed every 3 months. So basically, the constitutional rights of citizens were suspended. You dare not talk or write or publish against any part of government. Public meetings of more than 3 people were suspicious and better avoided. A knock on your door late at night could mean anything. Repression and fear was the norm. I have my own story there. It is not by chance that I became UN staff member and eventually left my country. Anyway, it used to be that human rights activists and experts would wince at the sole mention of Paraguay. But in 1989, the old regime was overthrown. And we started the ongoing process of building or rebuilding our democracy. We changed the national constitution. All rights were enhanced and given protection. Presidential power was curtailed, and martial law could only be established with congressional approval. But let me fast forward now to the preparation of our first UPR. And let me say first that it took us many years as a society and as a people to confront the horrors, the torments of this dark period. Documents, photographs, torture chambers, graves, all started coming out. I mention all this, still hard as it is, to say that coming into the year 2010, preparing for our first UPR was a catalytic moment for our process of rebuilding democracy. The restoration of human rights was at the center of our national recovery as we began to face the hard truths of what had happened to us as a people and as a republic. And even then, 20 years later, getting the information we needed to write the first UPR was very complicated. You could feel the lingering fear. Can I say this or should I respond to that? It felt like a real risk to be taken. Even our human rights unit at Foreign Affairs approached UPR bureaucratically in the very beginning. Letters were sent out with a deadline to respond to the enclosed questionnaire, and not a single institution responded. So we decided to get up and go out knocking on doors, institution by institution, sitting down and explaining what the report was to be used for, what was pertinent to their respective sectors in terms of human rights or in terms of our constitution and our legislation. And we begged, cajoled, threatened, got on our knees for their cooperation. I have to say here that it was the determination and conviction of our young diplomats and young officers in other parts of government that started the information for UPR finally flowing. 20 years later, after the coup d'etat, a new generation, without the fears, the hangups, could finally put into perspective what happened to us and move forward, trying to look for solutions to the problems that we still face today. and they were able to easily relate to the demands of the UPR process. And this was the beginning of our focal points of human rights in each institution, in all three branches of government, and the armed forces and the National Police Force. And these focal points became formal human rights units within these institutions. And thus we had the beginnings of our human rights network. As we completed our first report, we realized that we had the start of a baseline for human rights. We had the possibility to continue and follow up and build on the response that we received from our institutions. They were now willing participants and part of a network with a common vision. At this point, we had a resident expert from the High Commissioner Regional's Office, Ms. Valiña, who gave us valuable support, and she initiated and conducted the process of developing indicators for follow-up and monitoring human rights in consultation with each of these institutions. Our own IT unit at Foreign Affairs made this into a digital platform. This in turn became the basis of our system for the monitoring of implementation of recommendations from the Human Rights Council and the treaty bodies.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's really so inspiring to hear about the role of committed young diplomats in providing the information for the UPR and for the creation of the Human Rights Network towards a common vision. And I guess there's a global story behind one of the pressing human rights issues of the upcoming session, and that is around the rights of women and girls. So each year, the second session involves the annual full-day discussion on the human rights of women. And this year, panels at the Council will focus on gender-based violence against women and girls in public and political life, which unfortunately has been on the rise, and social protection, women's participation and leadership. Gender equality is, of course, at the heart of human rights and UN values. However, today, 75 years since the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we unfortunately see the global erosion of the rights of women and girls, including transgender, gender diverse, and intersex women. Achieving women's equality remains a huge global challenge that the Human Rights Council can play an important role in addressing. Ambassador Adam, throughout your career, you have been a champion of women, and it was an honor to work with you during our 10 years in Geneva, especially as a group of women ambassadors committed to supporting and advancing women's rights. Tell us why the full realization of the rights of women and girls is crucial for global peace and development, and what, in light of the 75th anniversary, the Human Rights Council must seek to achieve in its annual discussion of the human rights of women. Ambassador Adam, we're having some difficulty hearing you.
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
All good now.
Okay. Good afternoon, Professor Paul Williams, ambassadors of PL and IPG. I actually am really happy to see all of you and the colleagues who are very interested on the human rights and also with regard to the celebration of the 75th anniversary of Human Rights Council. I think this is a very important time as we look back on the developments of human rights promotion and protection. With regards to the women, the rights of women and violence against women. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we have arrived at a time that we see, as you very rightly said, Ambassador, my colleague, Ambassador Amanda, that alarming global rates of gender equalities and gender-based violence and discrimination. Sometimes at moments there is, I think, really concern that there is a reversal of access to reproductive or sexual health care, education, and wider civil society access. So this is very concerning for all of us. I myself, I think, coming from a small island country, the Maldives, where we women had to work very hard, even as 100% Muslim country, that women rights and the promotion was a challenge for the country itself. And I think globally, looking at the promotion of Human Rights Council's agenda on the rights of women, and especially on the violence against women, which is very crucial for the development and peace in the international community and even in our societies, whether it's nationally or regionally or internationally. I think there is cooperative mechanisms helps the country itself. And at the same time, institutionally, the Human Rights Council is able to advise various countries on the mechanisms that are available, the consultations that are there, within our countries, those crucial stakeholders that need to be discussed on the rights of the women, as well as promotion and protection of the women. And I think this huge agenda is, in any way, it is really a challenging task for everyone. For the promotion of and protection of women itself is difficult, but at the same time, for the women's rights to be promoted in such a way that the peace and development, it contributes to the peace and development of the global order, or even for our region and nationally, it helps you actually to think that we can actually depend on the international community's assistance, that countries are able to get benefit or assistance from the United Nations, as well as, I think, multilateral agencies, even regional bodies that are there to help assist us build our human rights mechanisms, for us to build our mechanism itself, and also cooperative structures that are informal and formal. I think this is very important. With regard to the, focusing specifically on the human rights of women and girls' centrality to peace and development, gender equality, it is not only a fundamental human right, but it also affects, it is a human right, but the full and effective participation of women in leadership at all levels of decision making in the political, economic, and in public life is crucial in tackling the biggest human rights and development issues of our time, including security structures, security to ensure that there is security for everyone, and the peace building and sustainable development in our international community, or even in our societies. And at the same time, there is a very important fact that women and girls are essential as change makers. They are empowered. They are able to help the societies within their, different groups or associations, or even organized groups of women, empowered women. And women become as leaders and participants in the global effort to build a sustainable and peaceful world. I think Ambassador Adam, Ambassador Zorika, and many of the colleagues who are here in the PILPG, we have been working at the Human Rights Council. We were working at the Human Rights Council on the empowerment, economic empowerment of women. This is also an agenda which focuses specifically that women themselves are able to communicate and also build on the peace and development. The discussions on peace and development by empowering themselves economically, that it will help them to be independent, confident, and also communicate that there are various ways that you can associate regionally as well. And I think this is very important. But more specifically, referring to the 75th anniversary of the Human Rights Council, I believe the UPR was very helpful, very effective, that we were able to, even as small developing countries, we were able to actually get the assistance from the UPR. The recommendations help us improve the human rights situation in our country on the promotion and protection of the rights. And the women themselves need self-help. So I think we were relying on these international structures or international organizations to assist us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you,
I
Ambassador.
think,
Go ahead, Amanda.
thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I think the data point on official development assistance, having previously run our development agency, that only 4% of bilateral ODA goes to programs where gender equality is the main objective. And yet you pointed out how essential women are as change makers. So we really need to use the UPR mechanism to leverage these changes systematically. Now, Paul, I know you had a question for Mr. Magazzini before I am going to ask Ambassador Adam another question about sustainable environment. So just wanting to check in with you as we co-moderate and try to keep to time.
Great. Perfect, Amanda. I'll jump in and put my question to Mr. Magazzini. Having already thoughtfully reflected on the challenges and the successes of the UPR mechanism in your opening remarks, I wanted to put the question to you of how can we further position the UPR mechanism as an essential platform to advance the prevention and the strengthening of accountability for the critical human rights issues of our time, in particular, women's rights and environmental issues that we're discussing today. Over to you.
Thank you, Paul. On the question of prevention, I would like to refer briefly to what happened in Myanmar with the Rohingyas. We all remember the critical situation they faced in country, the fact that in large number they were facing violations, if not killings, and many left into a huge humanitarian emergency situation to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. What many do not recall is the fact that the second cycle of the UPR of Myanmar took place in 2015. So just 1 year before most of this development occurred. And on the prevention front, I would like to say that there were many recommendations made to Myanmar on the need to repeal the 1982 citizenship law, articles of the penal code relating to the protection of race and religion laws that were discriminatory to not only the Rohingyas, but many other minorities. Unfortunately, these recommendations were noted by Myanmar, but they were also not taken into account by many who in those years were establishing or strengthening bilateral relationships. So my point here on the prevention front is we have a thorough checkup of the health system of any given country. I think it is important to do due diligence, to review the assessment made through the UPR, and then of course states take their own decision, but informed with the potential risk areas that may then develop into major humanitarian emergency situation with huge human and financial costs. On the development front and on doing the most to strengthen accountability in the national human rights protection system, the effectiveness of the administration of justice, strengthening overall the rule of law, I think we need to facilitate implementation and follow-up, because states that accept recommendation open up door for engagement. And the point I tried to make earlier, which I think would be important to reiterate here, is that the DAC community makes many recommendations to states, including those that are of priority for their own ODA. Now, if those very recommendations are accepted by the state under review, you would say it's a no-brainer. It should just happen to connect the dots. This is not happening. And if it is happening, it's only once every 100 times. And so much more can be done to facilitate bilaterally or through the UN system or other stakeholders support for implementation, because the stronger the national protection system, the more the UPR will ensure rule of law and a strong, accountable system in place. And next, of course, to the global north, the OECD DAC member, we have also the global south, and therefore increased form of South-South cooperation, not aimed at financial support, but maybe the sharing of expertise, know-how, what has been done successfully is something that we have seen happening. I mentioned the case of Paraguay with Simore Plus, but there are many others, and I hope that looking ahead, much more can happen so that we see more implemented in this fourth cycle of the UPR. Final point I would like to make, it's about the need for also broadening understanding of this UPR mechanism. I mentioned generally universities, but I would like to say, in my view, law schools, legal education should include in-depth knowledge of the UPR mechanism and how to use it to provide ministers the kind of guidance that would allow them to make good decisions when it comes to trade, development, political issues, human rights issues, and so on and so forth. So that's over to you with that. Thank you.
Absolutely terrific points. And as somebody who now works at a university, could not agree with you more about the importance of education, including the UPR mechanism. And I'm going to talk a little later about the work that we're doing with parliamentarians through the Commonwealth and the Interparliamentary Union to educate more on the UPR mechanism. So just know that you are heard and we are acting on your wise advice. The importance of prevention, strengthening accountability, and support for implementation, all such critical points. Thank you so much. And I know that the Global Governance Commission has also been looking in more depth at the UPR mechanism as a way for following up countries' commitments on environmental issues too. So I'm hoping to see more action on that when the Council meets under Mary Robinson's presidency next week. In October of 2022, the Human Rights Council recognized the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right, which I think is absolutely terrific. We are now seeing global calls to recognize this right at the national level. And we know that millions across the globe are displaced by climate change each year. In fact, I read a terrifying statistic recently that there are predictions as much as 2 billion people by the end of the century could be displaced as a result of the climate crisis. Just so difficult to even comprehend that number. Many suffer premature death as a consequence of pollution, and global biodiversity loss poses a huge threat to the entire planet. We know that climate change disproportionately impacts the poor, women and children, disabled, and of great significance to you, Ambassador, as a citizen of the Maldives, small island states. And I was delighted to be in the Maldives last year, hosted by Indo-Pacific Command and your Minister of Defense to talk about Pacific environment security. We witnessed a hugely significant development in the efforts of small island states last year to bring attention to environmental threats when there was a formal request made for an advisory opinion to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea on issues associated with sea level rise and climate change. So we'd love to hear from you, Ambassador, as some of the human rights challenges faced by small island developing states. And in fact, we should call you great ocean states, not small island developing states, great ocean states, as a result of climate change. And mindful of the 75th anniversary, what focus should the Human Rights Council take this year to address climate-related human rights challenges for great ocean states?
Thank you, Ambassador Adam. Actually, yeah, it is very good to say that we are ocean countries. We belong to ocean, and I think compared to the land area, most of the small island states, small island developing states are actually ocean countries. In fact, with regard to the security and the climate change, all the small island states, or the members of the Alliance of Small Island States, which we call the AOCs, all of us are actually lobbying, and we have for years, we have been really concerned that we are countries which and environmental disasters actually impacting on our countries, as we feel that it is an existential threat to our country for the life of the population, for our inhabitants, for the food security, as well as the environmental natural disasters that erode our soil, our coastal, even our coastal area is eroded. And from time to time, we have typhoons, cyclones. And I think with regard to the flooding is another matter, because our islands are very low-lying and not even higher than, I think, 1.5. So it at times like 2 meters above sea level. So it actually affects our country in magnitude much higher level than any other country. So we are actually threatened by the climate change and the natural disasters, the force and the unprecedented impact of climate change. Ever since I think the Maldives have been participating at international level, we have actually announced, our former leaders, presidents have announced even in 1980s about death of a nation, which the President Gayoom had announced that we are actually feeling the climate change or even environmental protection is necessary for our country's survival. And I think since then we have had in 2008, since we began the democratization, the Maldives have been leading on the AOCs with regard to the climate change that President Nasheed spoke at the climate change special summit in 2008 at the time. And I think he was among the 7 leaders of the country who spoke. And I think our voices, the small island states' voices was heard. And this is very important for the small island states, that our concern, our our need for assistance from the global community is very important, and how crucial it is that we act now. This is the kind of messages we want our international community to hear. And it becomes a threat for us in such a sense that apart from being a security threat, it is also about our rights, because it is right-based. And since 2009, the Maldives had actually, with the partners like Bangladesh, I think even New Zealand, Australia, some of the low-lying small states joined on our co-sponsorship. And we actually promoted a resolution and adopted with a large number of support from the members, that there was 2009 Human Rights Council resolution on the enjoyment of rights of human rights. So this was very important, so that members were able to actually appreciate the resolution. And from then it recognizes and had a report identifying the linkages of human rights to the climate change. And we have actually promoted this every year since then at the Human Rights Council, and developed a mandate, a special rapporteur expert who will actually look into the issues of human rights and the climate change and the impact on the different level of developing countries that we find. We also feel that the international community actually need to react very quickly, because from the various cyclones and climate change impact that we have seen even the last 5 years, we believe that it is unbearable that even our coral reefs have been damaged so much by the human or natural disaster that we have now to grow the coral. I think Amanda would have seen the Maldives, how it is, and we had to grow. And right now, the Maldives government and even our private shareholders have actually been looking into international assistance, that through the Green Fund or even international, I think, adaptation fund, that we need to grow the coral so that our coastal management policy will be adopted. And there is another issue that we also that has so to lives. They will have safe islands so that they can actually feel some comfort and able to live, sustainable life. we also believe that human rights is important for these small island states, because climate change is, here, and we have been actually living through the, impacts of climate change, the deterioration of even our building, our schools, our water and sanitation, and how severe that it is impacting even, I think our health facilities get eroded every time we have an impact of climate change. So we have to think of better policies, adaptation policies, so that we build better, that it will be resilient to this kind of climate change impacts. And I think this is important for us. With regards to further, I think, development that we have seen, I think after the Human Rights Council resolutions, we have taken it a step further with our partners, the AOSIS and many small island states, even developed countries who are feeling the threat of climate change or impact of climate. There is a resolution that was adopted at the UNGA, which asked the International Tribunal to find a legal opinion, to give a legal opinion on the impact of climate change and how it will have implications, legal implications on the states itself. I think this is a very important development. The deadline was in June. We believe that this will be giving a kind of a new agenda for the small island states or the climate vulnerable countries, to seek justice, in a sense that there is a kind of insurance and development mechanism that small island states impacted by climate change should have a sustainable policy. We should have a kind of a green fund or recycling carbon policy that will be enabling us to survive in a sustainable way.
Thank you so much. Some very important initiatives there, and great to see the work of Vanuatu and the International Court of Justice as well. As you point out, and as we heard from Mr. Magazini, it's so important to have universities engaged in this process, and we've been delighted to have the Allen Coral Atlas map all of the world's tropical shallow coral reefs and work alongside AOSIS and the small island states to see how that knowledge of mapping can then help with coral propagation. So some very practical connections to be made through the excellent points that you raised. Thank you so much, and I'll pass back to Paul.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. I wanted to pick up on this theme, Amanda, that you and Ambassador Adam have been discussing, and turn to Ambassador Aguirre and ask about a little bit more about the questions of the environment. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment visited Chile in May and concluded that the country faces an environmental crisis that violates human rights, particularly the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Now, Chile, like many countries in Latin America and globally, is suffering from a climate crisis of a scale unimaginable at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Universal Human Rights in 1948. Now, considering the dangerous impact of these crises, particularly on the marginalized and the vulnerable communities and environmental human rights defenders, what must the Human Rights Council focus on as it encourages states to tackle climate efforts from a human rights perspective? Ambassador, over to you.
Paul, I hope my Zoom doesn't go away again. But thank you again, Paul. Let me try this again. Your reference to the impact of climate change on marginalized and vulnerable populations and communities places me, I believe, right in the middle of my possible response. And you also mentioned other crises that made me think of disaster prevention and natural resources exploitation, like mining and drilling. David Boyd, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, who prepared the report on Chile, talks about sacrifice zones where marginalized and vulnerable communities suffer exposure to toxic substances and environmental degradation, water scarcity, as many rural residents lack access to safe and sufficient water and are endangered by deadly pollution of air. And in addition, these populations are exposed to droughts, desertifications, wildfires, heat waves, sea level rise, and extreme weather events. So in as much as these extreme events deeply affect and disturb the daily lives of men, women, and children, climate change is most definitely a human rights issue. experts in disaster preparedness and emergencies use the concept of resilience and resilience building. And resilience means and implies giving the people exposed to extreme events the means, tools, and set of mind to recover and rebuild their own communities. Providing them with these means implies that government authorities, both national and local, must address the pre-existing conditions. And to do it, they must address poverty, exclusion, discrimination. And so as they develop policies and actions in terms of human rights, they must consider and address their right to development. In their national, local, and planning and programming, they must promote and support their economic, social, and cultural rights. And I could go on, their right to water and sanitation, their right to housing, their right to health, their right to food, their right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So to build resilience in these groups of vulnerable and excluded community in terms of planning and programming, there is a need for multiple strategic and sectoral entry points. Focusing on their human rights clearly identifies what and where these entry points should originate. Because true development is that which is focused on the human person, wherever he or she lives, wherever he or she raises his or her family and makes his livelihood. This is a conceptual framework we started constructing in the 1990s, summit by summit, and we finally fully accepted the centrality of human person in development. And that is what made me start with the mention of the right to development. Preparedness, prevention, resilience, educated health, healthy men, women, and children, employment opportunities is what is needed by our vulnerable and excluded groups of population to confront and recover from the daunting challenges of climate change. We all know and we have accepted and approved our present sustainable development goals. And I'm fully convinced that on human rights, our Human Rights Council should continue to support and participate in the ongoing efforts throughout the UN development system and its agencies to fully establish linkages between SDGs and human rights, especially the economic, social, and cultural rights at country level and at subnational levels.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Those are such important points, and establishing those linkages is really, really so critical. I know too that this upcoming Human Rights Council will also reflect on Russia's ongoing war of aggression, forcing Ukraine to pause their fourth UPR cycle. And Ambassador Maric Djordjevic, I wanted to come to you and ask you if you could provide us with your brief reflections on, first, what has been the war's impact on Ukrainian women and girls? And second, what can we expect from the Human Rights Council in this upcoming 53rd session to provide assistance to Ukraine in the field of human rights?
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Paul and Amanda, for hosting this timely event, and thank you very much for your questions. Let me start by saying that no country in recent history, like Ukraine, has shown that when the world is fragmented, human rights are the glue to bring us all back together. Magnitude of solidarity for Ukraine has been unprecedented indeed. All events around Universal Declaration Human Rights 75 now are an important chance to galvanize international forces around human rights, prevention of violation, and respect for the international law, and bring that as a backbone of defense, justice, and peace in Ukraine, but also across the world. The ongoing, you're right, full-scale Russian invasion continues brutally disrupting each segment of life in Ukraine. However, the impacts of war are uneven, with significant effects on women, children, people with disabilities. At the beginning of 2023, the UN verified the killing of at least 2,296 women and girls since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The actual numbers are likely much higher. Women and their children represents 90% of the 10 million people forced to move from their homes in search of safety and security. Of those displaced inside Ukraine, 68% are women. Many have lost their homes and jobs and lack access to essential social services and protection. The war has also led to worsening inequalities and discrimination, increased gender-based violence, including domestic violence, conflict-related sexual and gender-based abuse, human trafficking, and of course, denial of access to, as I said, essential services and goods. Reports of some of these risks already becoming a reality have begun to surface. This demands an urgent gender intentional response to ensure that specific rights and needs of women and girls are prioritized. And that is the job of Human Rights Council and the UN Women, to deliver results across these strategic priorities. It is more essential, I think, than ever that the rights of women and girls remain at the center of humanitarian response. Many international organizations, including UN Women, now are conducting rapid gender assessment to ensure that up-to-date data and analysis on the gender dynamics of the war and its impacts are available to all those working on the response. They are providing experts to the United Nations Commission of Inquiry, established by Human Rights Council to investigate sexual violence, abuse, and exploitation of women and girls in a war. Several international national organizations are documenting war crimes like PILPG, and they have gathered horrifying testimony from women in Ukraine, detailing the impact of the invasion on their safety, health, and well-being. But despite these dire wartime circumstances, thanks to UPR, last UPR, women's rights and gender equality remain a priority for the Ukrainian government. And even in 2022, Ukraine ratified Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women, with a broad participation of women and women's organizations. They updated the National Plan on UN Women in Peace and Security, Resolution 1325, and they came up recently with a new state strategy for ensuring equal rights and opportunities for women and men by 2013. I want to use this opportunity to express an absolute admiration and respect for the women of Ukraine. They play a vital role in protecting their country and shaping its future. More than 60,000 Ukrainian women serve in the Ukrainian military, defending against Russian aggression. Thousands more to their part to help their country as journalists, paramedics, teachers, politicians, documentarians, and artists. So this is unprecedented, and this is really a great achievement. I think a new vital changing role of women in Ukraine. Going back, if I have time, do I have time, Paul?
We want to squeeze in one more question for Amanda before we run out of time.
Okay, let me just briefly then relate to the question of Human Rights Council 53 and what will happen there with Ukraine. First and foremost, it is important to mention that the mandate of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, established by Human Rights Council last 2022, has been renewed, very important. Then, as indicated, Ukraine for a cycle review of UPR has been postponed. So on Ukrainian request, the state of human rights in Ukraine now is screened through different mechanisms and tools. But what is important is that High Commissioner will present the annual report on a 53rd session, the Council will hold an interactive dialogue on the High Commissioner. There will be an interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on Ukraine, and the Council is expected to consider resolutions addressing various country situations and will include resolution on title cooperation with and assistance with Ukraine in the field of human rights. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Zorica. That was fantastic. As we're just wrapping up, I want to use the chair's privilege to ask my co-chair, Ambassador Ellis, the last question. Ambassador Ellis, you've been a huge supporter of investing in the empowerment of women and noting the society-wide benefits of promoting gender equality. What are some of the ways that countries can improve upon accountability for gender equality and the empowerment of women as they prepare to implement the recommendations of the Universal Periodic Reviews? Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Paul. This is my favorite question, and it really harks back to Mr. Magazzini's point earlier that we need to be educating people more about the UPR mechanism and providing parliamentarians in particular with information about what can be asked and what can potentially be changed. So there are a couple of links that are going to be dropped in the chat. The first one is an old project of mine at the World Bank, which is continuing, called Women, Business and the Law, which has now documented all of the laws that impact women and their ability to be economically active on the same basis as men across 190 countries. And we have at Arizona State University created a map and a notification tool. So anyone who's interested in an upcoming UPR can sign up, be notified, and get a beautiful summary, as you'll see if you click on the map, of the laws that still require changing to meet full gender equality. As of this year, only 14 countries have full gender equality under the law. So a wonderful mechanism to help advance the UPR's impact and influence. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Amanda. And that brings us right on time. That's unfortunately all we have time for today. It's been a real pleasure and quite frankly, an honor to have this conversation with you all around this virtual table today. And thank you to our nearly 200 registrants who've dialed in for this program. I hope you all have a great afternoon and a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.